Okay, so we're running live here. Thanks everyone for watching. Today we're going to talk about the principle of alternate possibilities again and Maria Alvarez's response to Harry Frankfurt's attempt to challenge that principle. So we talked about this last week. Just want to say some things to refresh your memories about that situation or that paper and the Frankfurt situations, and then Alvarez's discuss very briefly Alvarez's reply. And then move on to the topic of moral relativism. So that's the game plan now. I'm going to share my screen. I have a couple of presentations I put together. Hopefully you're all doing great. Happy Wednesday night. Okay, so, oops, I don't know what I just did. Let's see here. Not quite sure what I just did. Let's see, stop sharing. Okay, good. So we'll try this again. I don't know what I did. Okay, so here we are. So last week we were talking about the principle of alternate possibilities and Frankfurt's attempt to challenge it. So here's the principle. Person P is morally responsible for doing A only if P could have done other than A. So you may recall we ended up modeling this by a garden forking paths model or diagram. So at the very least, in order for P to be responsible for doing something, morally responsible for doing something, has to be the case that P could refrain from doing what A actually did. So if Jones is morally responsible for robbing the bank, then it has to be the case, doesn't it, that Jones could have avoided robbing the bank, or he could have refrained from robbing the bank more exactly. So that was the example that we used last time in connection to the Frankfurt cases as he attempts to try to challenge the principle of alternate possibilities. So he claims, as Frankfurt claims, that the principle of alternate possibilities is false. He uses a thought experiment method, as we've talked about. We need a case showing that someone's morally responsible for doing something, even though they couldn't have done otherwise. We were given the Jones cases, remember. So let this tilde represent not. So we need a case where an agent's morally responsible, but they couldn't have done otherwise. So there were no alternate possibilities open to the agent. So that's what the tilde AP means. A successful Frankfurt case, as they're nowadays called, is going to be one in which an agent is morally responsible, but one also in which they didn't have alternate possibilities open to them. Okay, so remember the Jones 1 case. Remember, all the cases involve Jones making a decision to rob a bank and then considering various situations in relation to that decision to rob the bank. And we're given 4 Jones cases. So in the first Jones case, remember, Jones goes to rob the bank on the basis of his own decision to do so. Jones, once he makes up his mind, then I think we need this. Sorry, I was throwing myself off because I had the wrong notation there. So, Jones, once he makes up his mind, he's set in his way, and he walks in to rob the bank, and he's threatened at gunpoint to rob the bank, but the threat doesn't faze him at all. So because he's resolute, after he makes a decision, he sticks with it. So in the Jones 1 case, it seems like he's morally responsible for robbing the bank. After all, he acted on the basis of his own decision making, and he could have done otherwise, it seems, because the threat didn't faze him. So if the threat's not enough to phase him, then it seems like he could have refrained. He could have made up his mind in a different way and done otherwise. So Jones 1, this case isn't going to be a successful counter to the principal alternate possibilities. The Jones 2 case, remember, is Jones is stampeded, quote unquote, by the threat. So everything is the same in the case. Jones decides to rob the bank. Everything is the same up to a point. Jones decides to rob the bank on the basis of decision making. He walks in to rob the bank, but he gets threatened at a gunpoint to rob the bank, and he's so stampeded by the threat that he robs the bank on the basis of the threat. And so in that case, we're inclined to say that Jones isn't morally responsible given how the threat manipulated him. And we think that in the Jones 2 case that that he's not morally responsible for it because he was so stampeded by it. And we might think that he was so stampeded by it that he couldn't have done otherwise but rob the bank. That's a possibility. So if that's the case, then we kind of have double, right? Double negations there. So it's not morally responsible, and it's such that he couldn't have done otherwise given how the threat moved him. The Jones 3 case, remember, Jones walks up to rob the bank. And just like in the previous cases on the basis of decision making, he goes to rob the bank. But then there's the threat, the usual threat. He's threatened at gunpoint to rob the bank, but he ends up robbing the bank on the basis of his own decision making. But were he not to have robbed the bank on the basis of his own decision making, then he would have robbed the bank on the basis of the threat, because the threat is enough to phase him. It's just that it wasn't necessary in the case because he was moved enough to rob the bank on the basis of his own decision making. So in this case, it looks like he's morally responsible for robbing the bank. After all, he robs the bank on the basis of his own decision making. But we might be inclined to say that he didn't have alternate possibilities open to him. He couldn't have done otherwise because, again, the threat would have been effective if his own decision making hadn't been. So in this way, he's unlike Jones 1 because the threat does phases him enough to where if his own decision making wasn't enough for him to rob the bank, then the threat would have been enough. But in this way, he's unlike Jones 2 because Jones 3 is such that the threat doesn't stampede him. It doesn't become such that that's the reason why he robs the bank, because in Jones 3, remember, he robs the bank on the basis of some decision making and not for the reason that Jones 2 acts. Jones 2 robs the bank on the basis of the threat. I put question marks here because some are inclined to think that if Jones 3 isn't phased enough by the threat that he could refrain from robbing the bank. At least that's one kind of consideration that's often used. I think Frankfurt's inclined to think that it succeeds, but he wants to go ahead and strengthen the case just to eliminate as much doubt as he can. So he goes ahead and rules it out for the sake of developing the Jones 4 case. So imagine in this situation, Jones decides to rob the bank on the basis of his own decision making, just like in Jones 1, 2, and 3. He goes to the bank, and in this case, Jones isn't threatened at gunpoint by someone. Instead, we have this counterfactual intervener. Frankfurt calls him Black, gives him a name. Remember, not the best choice of names. So he's a nefarious fella. This is a counterfactual intervener, someone who is going to intervene only if Jones begins to change his mind, right, and begins to think about not robbing the bank. So in this scenario, we might imagine the counterfactual intervener, the nefarious fella, hiding behind a bush or in a large white van in the parking lot. It has enough access to Jones 4's mental states that if Jones 4 even begins to think about backing out or deciding not to rob the bank, then this individual, this nefarious fella, will counterfactually intervene and make it the case that Jones 4 robs the bank. As it turns out, the counterfactual intervention wasn't necessary because on the basis of his own decision-making, Jones 4 robs the bank. It seems as if Jones 4 is morally responsible and he couldn't have done otherwise. And I put exclamation marks because according to Frankfurt, this is a successful Frankfurt case. Okay, so these Jones cases where an agent is morally responsible and it seems like he can't do otherwise, have come to be known, as I've noted, come to be known as Frankfurt cases. They weren't called Frankfurt cases when Frankfurt first wrote the paper. I don't think he knew that his paper was going to be as influential as it turned out to be. Okay, so that's all by way of review. I know there's a lot of detail there, so I just wanted to make sure that we're caught up to speed and refreshed on the material. So let's talk about now Alvarez's responses to the Frankfurt cases. I was going to go into more detail here, but I decided that that going into more detail might be a bit counterproductive, and I wanted to discuss the moral relativism this time as well. Okay, so Alvarez's response involves at least this initially. So recall that for the Jones 4 case to succeed in refuting the principal alternate possibilities, it must be the case that the nefarious counterfactual intervener, right, Frankfurt's black, makes Jones perform an action, and that he makes Jones perform the action in such a way that Jones cannot do otherwise. Okay. So that it's really important that that the Frankfurt case that's successful, if there is such a one, is that it makes it the case that Jones cannot do otherwise than what he in fact does. So if the relevant action that Jones performs is robbing the bank, then the counterfactual intervener has to make it the case that that Jones robs the bank in situations in which Jones would even think about refraining from robbing the bank, and making the case also that that in that situation there's nothing else possible that Jones could have done. Okay. So that's what's going to be needed, obviously, to refute the principal alternate possibilities. So if you were to represent this like in a garden of working paths model, you'd have like the timeline, you'd have the Jones, and he's deciding on what to do, deciding on robbing the bank. He decides actually to rob the bank. And then in every other possibility at that moment that Jones deciding to rob the bank, he would have to rob the bank. Every single possibility, every single outcome involves robbing the bank in that situation. Okay, so Alvarez's response continued. Alvarez claims that if the nefarious counterfactual intervener can get Jones 4, to do something such that he can't do otherwise, then in the counterfactual situation in which the intervention occurs, then Jones doesn't do what the intervener wants him to do. Right? Then Jones doesn't literally do what the intervener wants him to do. Right? So the idea here is just that easy way of putting it would be that it's really the intervener that's doing something and using Jones's body, as it were, to do the thing in question. So that's significant, right? Because in the counterfactual situation, then where we can't say that what Jones does is rob the bank. Okay, but Jones's action doesn't involve robbing the bank. There might be some loose way in which we can say, yeah, Jones robbed the bank in the counterfactual situation, in which a counterfactual intervener comes in and makes Jones rob the bank. But that's all kind of a manner of speaking, strictly speaking, given that the counterfactual intervener made Jones do something, the doing of which he couldn't possibly have avoided doing, eliminates the possibility of Jones having performed an action. Okay. So the response continued here, just to unpack this a little bit here, but if Jones doesn't do anything, he doesn't perform the action in the counterfactual case, then Jones refrains from doing what he does in the actual world. So here's a way of thinking about it that might be even more helpful, is suppose the intervention is required because for whatever reason, Jones begins to back out. He begins to change his mind. He gets cold feet, whatever. Suppose that happens. So Jones begins to decide to do otherwise. He begins to decide to refrain from robbing the bank. Once that happens, the intervention kicks in and Jones is forced to rob the bank, or Jones's body is forced to do the dirty work of the counterfactual intervener, the nefarious fellow's dirty work, as it were. So again, if Jones doesn't do anything, doesn't perform an action in the counterfactual case, then Jones refrains from doing what he does in the actual world. In the actual world, remember, he robs the bank on the basis of his own decision making. That's part of the reason why we say he's more than responsible for doing what he does. But in the counterfactual situation, remember, what happens is Jones shows signs of refraining, and then immediately the counterfactual intervener, kicks in, intervenes, and forces Jones, as it were, to move his body in such a way that he robs the bank. And this is enough to establish that the Jones 4 case fails, according to Alvarez. Remember, the nefarious counterfactual intervener intervenes only if Jones 4 begins to refrain from doing what he had decided to do. So now we can think about this in terms of the Garden of Working Paths model again. So you have that timeline. You have Jones, who's considering acting. Okay. Considering robbing the bank. He decides to rob the bank. He robs the bank on the basis of decision making. Now, in the counterfactual scenario or in the counterfactual situation in which the intervener comes in and forces Jones to rob the bank, Alvarez is going to say, look, what we were going to say there, if we're precise, is we're going to say that Jones refrained from robbing the bank. So the two possibilities, remember, to flesh this out, are Jones robs the bank in the actual world, and then in the counterfactual world, in the counterfactual scenario, as it were, the scenario that would have occurred were Jones 4 to have begun to refrain from just deciding to rob the bank. He begins to change his mind. Right? In that case, we're going to say, Alvarez says, is Jones refrains from robbing the bank. Right? And you might add to that, Jones refrains from robbing the bank, so counterfactual intervener used Jones's body to rob the bank or some such. I mean, just think about like the kind of manipulation that would be required to get Jones to rob the bank, such that he can't refrain, he can't possibly do otherwise. Right? Think about the kind of control that would have to be exerted on an agent, on a person in that kind of situation. in effect, what would seem to result is being able to control someone such that you can move the limbs of their body to get them to do what you want them to do. But merely moving the limbs of someone's body to get them to do what you want them to do isn't the same thing as them deciding to do something. And that's Alvarez's point. Is once you make the manipulation so strong that Jones 4 can't do other than rob the bank, then you're assuming a kind of manipulation that amounts to, in some sense, almost like having like a remote control type manipulation over someone's body. But in that case, remember then what that would mean is that Joan must have then exerted his agency enough to refrain from robbing the bank such that the intervention, the manipulation kicks in. And so that we can describe the counterfactual situation as one in which Jones refrained from robbing the bank. His intervener used Jones's body to rob the bank. Okay. Now there could be other things like, some people, and Alvarez discusses this in her paper, they might say something like, well, it could be that what the nefarious counterfactual intervener does is instill in Jones a kind of irresistible desire. And in response to that, it's possible that Alvarez claims like, look, in order for desire to be like a genuine desire had by someone, it's got to be the kind of thing that is at least to some degree resistible. So that's like a natural thing to say. We use the term irresistible to be hyperbolic, really, right? Desire was irresistible. Does it literally mean that we couldn't have avoided acting on that desire? There's no possible way in which we could have avoided acting on desire. We don't literally mean that when we use that expression. And if we did, then if the desire were irresistible, the thing to say here is if the counterfactual intervener has the ability to instill a genuinely irresistible desire, then he is able to exhibit a kind of control over Jones that really is like the remote control type control that manipulates Jones in such a way that, look, he would have to have showed signs of refraining from robbing the bank, and that'd be his exercise of agency. And then where that ends, begins the manipulation, the instilling of this irresistible desire to get Jones to irresistibly rob the bank, supposing, right, that's even possible. Okay, so that last bit is a bit of class discussion. So hopefully it's clear how Alvarez replies to the Frankfurt cases, and the debate continues, as you can imagine. Okay, so that's the end of the Alvarez discussion, Alvarez/Frankfurt discussion. Let's now switch gears. We'll switch gears to moral relativism. Okay, let me just expand this outwards. Okay, so we're going to focus on cultural relativism. There are other kinds of relativism out there. One kind is individual relativism. So here's an initial statement of moral relativism, basic idea. What is right and wrong, morally speaking, for the members of a culture is ultimately determined by the basic moral norms of their culture. So you're going to have these basic moral norms that feature in a culture, and from those we're able to derive other moral norms, but it's the basic ones that determine right and wrong in a culture. So if we go to the Timmons here, so I had you study a chapter from Timmons this week. So he begins, I was looking through the paper earlier. If we begin here, he notes at the very beginning of the moral relativism chapter. So Mark Timmons, University of Arizona professor, he notes this: studies of the moral beliefs and practices of various cultures reveal different cultures often have very different moral beliefs and attitudes about the same sort of action. Consider a few examples. Honor killings. Members of some groups think that if an unwed woman becomes pregnant, it is the obligation of her family to kill her to restore family honor. And then parricide. Anthropologists report that many cultures practice parricide, killing one's parents once the parents become aged, is a practice that members of the community, including the parents, take to be morally permissible and perhaps even morally required. Okay, obviously that view wouldn't fly, or that practice wouldn't fly in our culture. Neither would the honor killings. They may in others, even if they're rare. Premarital sex and wife sharing. Some cultures do not think that there is anything wrong with premarital sex. Indeed, it is condoned as an important and normal part of courtship. Moreover, in some cultures, it's considered a great honor if one's wife engages in sexual relations with other men. Okay. Right. So some of that obviously doesn't cohere with our moral code, if I could put it that way, with our moral culture. Cannibalism certainly doesn't. So cannibalism, there are numerous documented cases of cultures that engage in the eating of human flesh. Members of such cultures think the practice not only morally permissible, but in some cases obligatory. Okay. And then the treatment of animals. Again, anthropologists report that many cultures are indifferent to the suffering of animals. That's probably close to our culture to some degree, at least with respect to some animals. I'll think about the vast widespread meat eating in our culture. For instance, in recent times, there have been some groups who pluck live chickens in the belief that their meat will be particularly succulent. Other cultures condone games that involve inflicting intense pain on animals. We tend to specialize. We tend to think that, like, among the animals that are our pets, their suffering matters, but not the suffering of animals on farms, food farms, industry farms, factory farms, etc. Okay, the dominant kinds of farms that animals are raised on for killing, for our eating. Okay, and the list could go on, right? So the statement of moral relativism is just basically saying what's right and wrong, morally speaking, in a culture, in a society, is ultimately determined by the basic moral norms of their culture, or of a culture. And I try to model this to some degree. Sometimes when I've taught, I should say often when I've taught on the issue of moral realism versus moral relativism, even if just briefly as a kind of aside or a response to a student in a class, in an ethics class, I might say something like, look, if you doubt whether there are any moral facts that are objective that hold across or hold in a transcending way in relation to the various moral codes that we find in different cultures, just think about examples like rape, slavery, genocide. It seems like it's wrong to rape or to enslave or to perform genocide, even if there are moral codes that permit or require those activities, right? On the basis of the basic moral norms of those cultures, of those moral codes. And sometimes, perhaps often, the response I get is, well, the rapist doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. The slave owner doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. And or the Nazis or Hitler doesn't think he's doing anything wrong, as if appealing to the norms of the perpetrators of rape, of the norms, perhaps of the moral codes, I should say more exactly, of those individuals who subscribe to those moral codes, who would rape or enslave or commit genocide on a group of people, right? Like matters, as if their moral codes are enough to determine what counts as moral. Full stop. But as if there aren't any genuine moral facts that would hold independently of what the rapist or the slave owner or the Nazi holds, right? Or perhaps more exactly, holds independently of the moral codes which would permit rape, slavery, genocide. Okay. So here's the way I kind of model the view. So, well, before I model the view, let's just get clear on this idea of a moral code, because that might be tripping you up here a little bit. I'm assuming that there's something like a moral code that we have, like in our quote unquote culture. It might turn out that that what's really going on in our quote unquote culture is really just a set of subcultures, and there's some overlap with respect to the moral codes that are had in the various subcultures. And so I'm going to assume that something like the overlap in the moral codes, or the overlapping aspects of the moral codes in these various subcultures, could be described fairly accurately, though very incompletely, here in Moral Code 1. So basic norms: avoid harm, don't kill, don't overtake to rob, don't torture, don't cheat, don't lie. And then there's some do good type principles: preserve life, protect property, be honest in one's dealings, help others when they're in need. There's going to be the heroic or the supererogatory, that which counts as going above and beyond the call of duty. Help as many people as one can, sacrifice one's life for others. These would all go above and beyond the call of duty. There's going to be certain principles related to moral education. We think that the youth need to be taught the moral code. We need to instill habits of action in accordance with the moral code in our youth and others. We need to instill moral emotions, moral responses in accordance with the moral code. So, like, we need to instill, like, moral pride for doing that which is right, moral shame for doing that which is wrong. Okay. Emotions related to praising others, blaming others, or praising some, blaming others, etc., etc. This is meant to just be a very incomplete moral code. Okay. Now, the moral relativists would say, well, what counts as morally right and wrong is just determined by the basic norms that constitute the moral code. And this is like the moral code of some culture 1. Okay. Where culture 1 here just might be understood as involving a set of subcultures that are in some way closely related. But that's the basic idea. A basic idea in the sense that it's incomplete, but I don't think that I'm too off in what I've listed here as part of our moral code. So let's model moral relativism. Here's moral code 1, moral code 2, moral code 3, moral code 4, and moral code 5. And the moral codes, they find themselves, right, as being aspects of these 5 different cultures. And these variables that are used, and no set of variables is the same in the 5 codes. So that's supposed to represent the fact that the moral codes are different in terms of what they have listed in them. Okay, you see there's some overlap, but no, and that might be common across different cultures and the moral codes that we find in those cultures. But what defines a right action? So actions are right relative to moral codes only. So moral relativism can be defined always as the view according to which right actions, we're talking about cultural moral relativism, actions are right relative to the moral codes that cultures have, which are relative to culture, societies. Rightness is that which is required by one's moral code. What's wrong action? Actions are wrong relative to moral codes, which are relative to cultures or societies. Wrongness just means, or wrongness is determined by what is forbidden by one's moral code. So according to moral code 1, it's forbidden to kill. It's forbidden to just inflict harm generally, but to kill, overtake, to rob, torture. So that's where you're going to get the forbiddenness. And then you get the doing good, counting as perhaps the right actions. And so rightness will be determined by the set of actions in the moral code that are deemed required by that moral code. And then of course we know they're the permissible or the optional. Actions are optional, neither right nor wrong. Neither right nor wrong relative to moral codes, which are also relative to culture, society is optional. To be optional just means that according to the moral code, the action in question is neither required nor forbidden by the moral code. Okay. So some people, when they initially think about the nature of morality, they tend to, and they're inclined to think that, well, we just have these various cultures with their different moral codes. And that's all there is to morality. There's no moral code, as it were, that we can assess other moral codes by. No objective moral code by which we can assess, right, the various moral codes that are out there. Now, we've talked about some moral theories here in this class, of course. Think about consequentialism. Most common kind of consequentialism, utilitarianism. The utilitarian would say, oh, look, there is an objective moral code. We might have a complete one or perfectly worked out, but the correct moral code that's objective is going to have at its foundation the principle that we're to promote the happiness of all. To promote the happiness of all. And then there's going to be a moral code that results from thinking about that very general objective principle. So the consequentialist or the utilitarian, more specifically, is going to say, oh, there is an objective moral code, and we can use our moral code, the correct moral code, to assess other moral codes. Now take the Kantian moral code, a duty-based kind of moral code, or the Rossian moral code, which is also duty-based. There's going to be an objective moral code. You're going to get the moral code that drops out of thinking about Kant's categorical imperative. You're going to have the moral code that drops out of thinking about Ross's prima facie duties. Right? Both of those systems that give us moral codes, right, or give us a moral code, are such that we could then evaluate the various moral codes because there's a claim to objectivity. Okay, thinking about the moral codes from, say, Kant, Ross. And then also, as we've noted, utilitarian. And the same thing would be true for the moral code that drops out of thinking about virtue ethics. Okay? Okay, so an implication of moral relativism is that what's known as the universality thesis, it fails, it's false. So what is a universality thesis? It's UT. There are universally true moral standards that are independent of any particular moral code. Universally true. So they're true, which means that there's objectivity, as far as we're understanding true in an objective kind of way, which the UT thesis is committed to. So we have this universality thesis. The reason why UT would be false, right, is that according to the cultural moral relativism that we're talking about, the moral standards, they all derive from the moral codes, and there's no universal moral standard that's true, objectively speaking, independent of any particular moral code, such that then we could assess the various other moral codes. So compare this with absoluteness. A moral norm or standard is absolute if it does not depend on any particular moral code. So the universality thesis has built into it this kind of absoluteness that we find in the various moral, normative, ethical traditions that are dominant in the history of philosophy, even now, even up to now. Excuse me. So UT does not imply, though, that the standards in question serve to determine the rightness or wrongness of most or all action. So the universality thesis is perhaps limited in its scope. Like all by itself is consistent with there just being one or two standards. And then we can use those one or two standards to evaluate, at least to some degree, even if it's to a small degree, the various moral codes that are on offer. So accordingly, UT does not serve as a basis for evaluating the correctness of all or most moral codes, at least all by itself. Okay. All right. But there is a single true morality thesis that would put us in a position to do that kind of evaluative work. So imagine the utilitarian view is trying that view, or at least adherents of that view and promulgators of that view are attempting to develop a single true moral system by which we can assess all the moral codes out there, right, if need be, right? So here's STM, the single true morality thesis. There's a single true morality that holds for all human beings, which features a set of moral norms that can be used to determine the correctness, incorrectness, etc., proportionality even, of all or most all actions. Okay, that's captured by the utilitarianism example, but it would be also by the categorical imperative Kantian example, and also the Rossian prima facie duties system. So this thesis goes beyond what UT specifies. So the single true morality is going to entail the universality thesis. Okay, so the single true morality view is stronger in that it entails the weaker universality thesis. According to universality thesis, again, there are just some universally true moral standards independent of any particular moral code. STM says that there's a single true morality that can be used to determine the correctness of all or most all actions, which it really expands the scope, right, of this view of morality compared to just thinking about the universality thesis, which is consistent with the scope being quite limited. But of course, even though the single true morality may entail the universality thesis, same isn't true, right? If we go the other direction, universality thesis doesn't entail the single true morality thesis. Okay. And at least the way Timmons defines these, the big thing has to do with the scope of the theses, right? The scope of the universally true, right, moral principles that could be used to, right, assess the various moral codes on offer. Okay. Now, this is an important point worth spending some time on. It seems like it's a pretty trivial part of morality that context matters, that the circumstances that we find are relevant to the morality of our actions. Some, they confuse context sensitivity with moral relativism. So the fact that the context that we find ourselves in is relevant to the correctness of our, to determining the correctness of our action, they confuse that with the claim that the moral code, right, that is a prevalent one as part of our culture, being that which determines what counts as right and wrong or optional. But they're distinct claims, aren't they? So we'll define context sensitivity here. The rightness or wrongness of an action in some context C in part depends on non-moral facts that hold in C. And Timmons gives us this nice example of a drowning child. Let me find the Timmons here. Okay. Here we go. So section 2 of his paper. He says it's uncontroversial that what is right or wrong for someone to do can often depend on one's circumstances, including facts about one's culture. Let's make this a little larger. Right. So what is right or wrong for someone to do can often depend on one's circumstances, including facts about one's culture. I'm going to call such dependence the context sensitivity thesis. The important point about this thesis is that it is not equivalent to moral relativism, nor does it imply relativism. Since failure to understand this point leads to confusion, it is well worth our time to examine this thesis and compare it to moral relativism. Let's begin with some illustrations of the thesis in question. What is right or wrong to do in a situation depends on certain facts about the situation in question. Suppose that you are an expert swimmer, and one day while walking along a deserted beach, you see a young child flailing away in the water some 20 yards from shore. You're struggling for air and obviously in immediate danger of drowning. You surely have a moral obligation to rescue the child. But suppose it is I who am walking along the same deserted beach, someone who can't swim. Since I would almost certainly drown if I tried to rescue the child, I do not have an obligation to go into the water to save the child, though I have an obligation to run and call for help. So here, the particular type of action that you ought to do is not the same as any particular type of action that I ought to do. So the non-moral features, circumstantial features that are relevant in these situations involve facts about knowing how to swim. So knowing how to swim all by itself isn't a moral property, isn't a moral feature. Likewise, not knowing how to swim, right, itself is a non-moral feature. So it does seem, though, that these non-moral features are relevant to whether or not one is required to save the drowning child. In the first case, because you know how to swim, you're quite expert at swimming, let's say, that fact, that non-moral facts generates, given the other aspects of the case, that there's someone drowning nearby, at least in part, generates the moral conclusion that all things being equal, you ought to save that the drowning person's life. But the non-moral fact that I would most likely drown if I were to try to save the drowning person, right, suggests that all things being equal, that I don't have an obligation to save the the person the child who's drowning, right, in the water or in the beach. Okay, in the water, I should say, at the beach. Okay. So of course, if he continues, this is Timmons. Of course, the reason our specific obligations differ in this case is that there's a difference between us in this case. Sorry, is that there is a difference between us that in this case is morally significant. You can swim, I can't. And it is this fact about our situation that helps explain why you have an obligation to perform a certain specific action, why I do not. So sometimes differences in facts about agents can affect what is morally right or wrong to do in a particular context. But the fact that what is right or wrong depends in this way on facts about agents has nothing to do with moral relativism. The point I'm making is often explained by pointing out that moral norms or principles have different implications depending on different situation, depending on differences in situation or context. The following is a plausible moral principle of aid. One ought to help those who are in need of help when one is in a position to do so and can avoid serious risk of life and limb to oneself. Suppose for the moment that this principle is universally valid independently of the moral code of any culture. Still, this principle, when applied to the two cases just described, the case where there's someone drowning and you know how to swim, the case where someone's drowning, I don't know how to swim, yields different moral verdicts about what each of us ought to do. In short, the application of moral principles will yield different moral verdicts in different contexts depending on the morally relevant details of the context. This is uncontroversial and something that's compatible with the denial of moral relativism. Okay, so some, they may confuse context sensitivity with moral relativism. Hopefully we're clear now on the difference, right? Moral relativism, the cultural moral relativism that we're talking about, is a view according to which the rightness of an action is determined by the basic norms of a moral code. Context sensitivity, the rightness or wrongness of an action is in part determined by non-moral facts that hold in some context. See, and hopefully the case of the drowning child clarified the difference between the two. I've talked to many, I should say, who think that in order for morality to not be relative, to not be culturally relative, what's required is that there be some principle that holds in every possible context without admitting any variation whatsoever. Okay? But that's implausible. And that's just a false way of thinking about things. We saw this already, though, haven't we, to some degree, when we thought about Ross. Remember, W.D. Ross's view had it that there are these prima facie duties that we have. And on his view, the moral principles, they hold, for the most part. In some cases, they may even conflict, and we have to decide which moral principle we're going to violate and which we're going to uphold. No principle holds in the absolutely categorical way that the categorical imperative or the absolute principle of utilitarianism holds, according to Ross. Nonetheless, on Ross's view, the fundamental moral principles, they're objectively true. And his view is in stark contrast to moral relativism. Okay, so that's just to say that we kind of already knew this, but it wasn't drawn out. Even though I did try when I talked about Ross to say that his view is an objective view, right? In that way, it's an objective view in the way that provides us with a moral theory, a moral code, or a way of working out a moral code, even at the very least, that doesn't rely on the moral code, the basic moral code, the basic norms in a moral code that we find in some culture or other. Okay. Okay, so why be a moral relativist? Well, when we examine the world, we notice that there's significant and widespread moral diversity. There are all kinds of different moral beliefs out there. Different cultures have different moral norms in place, different basic moral norms even. So here's the MD thesis, the moral diversity thesis. Moral codes conflict with respect to basic fundamental moral norms, and such conflict is widespread. Okay, so something that MD supports MR. Okay. So here's the way Timmons puts MD. The moral codes, one, the moral code of some cultures include basic moral norms that conflict with the basic moral norms that are part of the moral codes of other cultures. And such fundamental conflicts are widespread. So part of the moral diversity thesis is this notion of the disagreements and conflicts being widespread. I'll just try to capture MD a bit simpler here on the slides. Okay. So here's going to be, after unpacking a bit of that, what Timmons goes on to say is like, look, the anthropologist is the one in the study of various human culture. So think here about the cultural anthropologist. They're gonna discover that different human cultures have different moral codes, and so he labels the argument really from moral diversity, widespread moral conflict across moral codes, the anthropologist argument, because presumably the anthropologists are going to be the ones who discover the moral diversity thesis, okay, and may even promulgate it as true, okay, and then use it to generate some kind of moral relativism, cultural moral relativism claim. So one, different cultures have different moral codes. In particular, the moral codes of some cultures include basic moral norms that conflict with the basic moral norms of other cultures, and such fundamental conflicts are widespread. So this just is the moral diversity thesis. This just equals MD. Number one, that is. Number two, if MD is true, then there are no universally valid moral norms applying to all cultures. So we have the denial of UT. The denial, that is, of the universality thesis, right? Take ourselves back to UT, right? There are universally true moral standards that are independent of any particular moral code. Okay. Three, if there are no universally valid norms applying to all cultures, so you have the denial of UT in the if part, then what's right and wrong for members of a culture depends on the basic norms of their culture, equals MR. Thus, moral relativism is true. Okay, so here's my shorthand for it, AA1 for anthropologist argument one. The moral diversity thesis is true, MD is true. Two, if MD is true, then UT is false. So MD and UT, they're mutually exclusive in that way, okay, as you would expect, wouldn't you? Three, so UT is false. And all we've done here is move from 1 to 2. 1 to 2 in logic, get us 3 for free. So now we have UT being false. But then if UT is false, then moral relativism is true, because there's no universally true moral principles, as it were, that we could then use to assess moral codes themselves. And of course, if UT is false, then STM is false, okay? Because then there's not going to be a system, a single true moral system that gives us a large set of universally true moral principles that we could then judge the vast majority of moral codes with, right? So by using the weaker principle, we can target the stronger one as well. Okay, so MD is true. The anthropology tells us that the moral diversity thesis is true. Okay, but if the moral diversity thesis is true, then universality thesis is false, because those are mutually exclusive for reasons we've talked about now. 3, so if UT is false, so 3, UT is false. There's no if there, excuse me, bad reading. 4, if UT is false, then MR, moral relativism, is true. That just are the moral codes, right, that determine the rightness. There's no universal principle from which, right, some objective moral claims or moral claims could be used to assess the various moral codes. And then from 3 and 4, we get 5. So, and just by logic, we get this one, just like using the very same inference rule that allows to get from 1 to 2 to 3. Okay. So yeah, this is page 50 of the Timmons. It's just a more elaborate argument. I just put it in more concise form here, hoping that it might be helpful to see it in this very simple logical form. The logical form is a bit hid here, given that there's just more words, but hopefully looking at both will help out. Okay. So then basically what Timmons does is he goes through the premises to make sure that the argument's a good one. He ends up arguing that the argument is not a good one. Okay. So he ends up challenging the second premise. So that if the moral diversity thesis is true, then the universality thesis is false. So if moral diversity is true, then the universality thesis is false. So suppose there's significant moral disagreement or significant moral conflict regarding a scientific example like flat Earth, the Earth, like the shape of the Earth. There are plenty of scientific cultures, communities that believe that the Earth is spherical. It seems more and more people nowadays want to claim that the Earth is flat. There's even documentaries on Netflix that you can watch about this. A growing community of flat earthers out there. The Flat Earth Society. It's a real thing. Okay? Right? So there could be scientific diversity. We can imagine a scientific diversity principle. So let's take this. So scientific claims could conflict with respect to basic fundamental scientific norms or whatever, and such conflict is widespread. Widespread, I mean, just suppose for argument's sake, right, that there's widespread scientific disagreement regarding the shape of the Earth. Yeah? Does it follow that there's no universally true scientific claim that could be used to evaluate whether or not the Earth is spherical or flat? Timmons says, no, it doesn't follow. So it looks like we have good reason, don't we, to reject premise 2. So the basic upshot here is just that diversity of belief, widespread diversity of belief across different cultures of people doesn't imply that the universality thesis is false, or that some universal claim in relation to diversity of belief claims is false, right? So what would be needed is to establish that there's some difference between the moral case and the scientific case, as you can imagine here, right? And that's going to get into the reply, but at least we have an initial reply to the anthropologist's argument 1, that this premise seems faulty. We use a flat Earth example to show that, and we're just following Timmons here. So if my discussion of it wasn't terribly clear here, consider this paragraph on page 50 from the Timmons. One source of difficulty is premise 2, which asserts that intercultural disagreement or conflict about some matter of fundamental moral importance entails that there's no single truth about the matter in question. And not a single truth, not a single true claim that holds, right, in that objective kind of way. But why should mere difference in belief over some issue entail that there's no single correct belief about that issue? The difference in belief about the shape of the Earth. There still could be, couldn't there, a correct belief about the shape of the Earth, namely that it's spherical. Right? Different cultures have had and may still have different beliefs about the shape of the earth, some believing it is flat, others believing it is spherical, others perhaps believing something else. But from the fact that there are differences in belief about the shape of the earth, we do not first conclude that there's no single truth about its shape, and then, as in the above argument, go on to conclude that the truth about the shape of the earth is relative. That is literally flat for those who believe it is flat, because their scientific code entails it is, right? That'd be crazy to think that, wouldn't it? Spherical for those who have this belief, and so on. In other words, in general, we do not suppose that mere difference in belief about a subject means that there's no single truth about that subject. There may be disagreement about mathematical claims, right? There still could be some universally true mathematical claim. Okay, so that's just to give a mathematical example. A scientific example seems to work as well. What about premise one? Is the moral diversity thesis true in the first place? So, suppose someone pushes back and says, oh, there's a difference between the moral and the non-moral, difference between the moral and the scientific, between the moral and the mathematical, right? That might be initial reply. Well, no worries. Let's challenge premise one then. Is the moral diversity thesis true? So the moral diversity thesis relies on there being fundamental moral disagreements and there being widespread fundamental moral disagreements. Right. So what's the difference between fundamental and non-fundamental moral disagreement? So the reason why you need to kind of get clear on this is sometimes understanding the contrast concept in question will allow us to understand, right, the concept that we're trying to understand. We need to understand what a fundamental disagreement is, as opposed to a non-fundamental one. And so keep in mind that the MD thesis requires that there be fundamental moral disagreements, and that those fundamental disagreements are widespread. So we're disagreeing at a fundamental level as opposed to a non-fundamental level. And so we're given these examples on page 51 and 52. So on page 51, Timmons writes, the thesis of moral diversity asserts that there's some intercultural conflict at the level of basic moral norms. And moreover, it asserts that such conflict is widespread. Now, one might suppose that the work of anthropologists in describing different moral beliefs, attitudes, and practices of different cultures easily and plainly establishes the moral diversity thesis. However, this issue is more complicated and hence more controversial than it may at first appear. To see why, we need to distinguish what may be called fundamental moral disagreement from non-fundamental moral disagreement. Okay. So the moral diversity thesis itself may be problematic. Okay, so hey, just one moment here. Oops. Okay, I'm going to take a couple-minute break here. Just because I've gone on for a little bit. Before I dive into this, I want to take just a quick break. Here's some Beethoven, a couple minutes of Beethoven. Be right back and we'll continue. Thank you. let's just get to the gloomy part of the song. Oh, actually, that was perfect. The entire song. Wow. Good timing there. Okay, so here we go. Yeah, thanks for that. Hopefully a 2-minute reprieve in the middle of the lecture was good for you too. Okay, so we're trying to understand the difference between a fundamental and a non-fundamental moral disagreement, because according to the moral diversity thesis, the claim is that there is widespread fundamental disagreement across the different moral cultures, right? And then that that disagreement is widespread. But if it turns out that the disagreements across cultures, even if widespread, is non-fundamental, then the moral diversity thesis itself would fail, wouldn't it? Because the claim is strong; it's the fundamental disagreements. So here's right. So we're going to see an argument presented, and seeing this argument will begin to help us see the difference between a non-fundamental and a fundamental moral disagreement. So here we go. Imagine that you and I disagree about the morality of capital punishment, and I think it's morally wrong. You do not. So we're going to be given a kind of example of a non-fundamental moral disagreement here. Our disagreement may stem from the fact that we disagree about certain non-moral factual matters. Suppose then that I believe that capital punishment has no positive social benefits, and in particular that it is not an effective crime deterrent. And suppose that I accept as a basic moral norm the following. 1, in response to violations of its laws, the society ought to employ those punishments that have overall beneficial consequences for society. This norm, together with my non-moral belief about the effects of capital punishment, 2, capital punishment does not have overall beneficial consequences for society, lead me to conclude that capital punishment ought to be abolished. Okay, and then Timmons continues. Now, like me, you accept the above basic norm P. Okay, so this is accepted. Okay, in response to violations of its laws, a society ought to employ only those punishments that have overall beneficial consequences for society. That's P. But there's disagreement. You disagree with me about the deterrent effects of capital punishment. So you reason as follows. 1, in response to violations of its laws, a society ought to employ only those punishments that have overall beneficial consequences for society. Okay, looks like 1 is held in common, because that's just P. 2, capital punishment, because it's an effective crime deterrent, does have overall beneficial consequences for society. Thus, it's not the case that capital punishment ought to be abolished. Now, we can imagine, couldn't we, someone disagreeing on 3, right? Maybe it would have been more clear had Timmons called this maybe 3-star or given it some other tag. 3 and 3-star conflict with each other. 3 and 3, unfortunate that he didn't do that. They conflict. They're contradictory. Okay. But the disagreement here is claimed to be non-fundamental because the disagreement isn't over the moral principle, right? The basic moral norm. The basic moral norm is a claim about employing punishments, and society ought to employ punishments in such a way that when they do so, they have the best overall consequences, right, for the society. Okay, that's held in common. So there's agreement on the morality, on the moral principle. There's disagreement about the non-moral facts. In this case, the deterrence facts in particular. So in this case, capital punishment does not have overall beneficial consequences for society, doesn't deter enough future murders, future crimes, etc. Okay, that's what's believed by this individual. But then this other individual over here believes that capital punishment is an effective crime deterrent, so it does have the beneficial or overall beneficial consequences for society. So there's disagreement, but the disagreement is over sort of the empirical facts the non-moral empirical facts as opposed to the moral principles. So the idea here would be that a disagreement can be fundamental when it's over the basic moral principle or the basic moral norm. So in order for the disagreement here to be fundamental, the moral disagreement to be fundamental, it has to be the case that there's disagreement about one. So this individual accepts P, and this individual over here accepts not P. Again, the numbering here just is not good. 1 and 1 prime, if we were to call this 1 or 1 star, those would be contradictory in a case where there's disagreement over the fundamental moral principle. Okay. So that gives us a sense of the difference between fundamental, non-fundamental moral disagreement. He gives another example here. Just to give an example of what the fundamental moral disagreement might look like in a bit more detail. So it would be enough if one here, the second one, 1 star, if it says something like, in response to violations of its laws, a society ought to employ only those punishments that, right, are based on providing, retribution, right, or only those punishments that are in line with inflicting harm on those who have committed crimes which created suffering, right, or some such, right? There we'd have a fundamental moral disagreement because one is kind of giving us a consequentialist view of punishment, whereas the one over here, 1 star, if we just build in a 1 star, would give us some other account of punishment. It would be a non-consequentialist version. And so to capture this, we finally get some adequate notation here. We get P star, and P star is punishments for crimes ought to involve, whenever possible, inflicting harm on the wrongdoer that is equivalent to the harm the wrongdoer inflicted on his or her victims. That's not a consequentialist principle of punishment. It's what we call a retributivist view that's based on retribution. And in particular, this is something like a lex talionis view of punishment, which you may have heard of, like the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth type account of punishment. Okay. All right. So hopefully that helps us with understanding the MD principle more. The claim again is that our fundamental or widespread disagreements, moral disagreements, are like these, are like the ones between those who disagree on the fundamental principle of punishment, as opposed to empirical facts in relation to trying to settle a debate like the capital punishment debate. Okay, so there can be disagreement about this moral issue, the capital punishment debate, that ends up being like non-fundamental because it's not concerned with really moral issues. What decides debate is, I should say, is not dependent on moral issues. What decides debate is related to something non-moral, the empirical facts, the empirical effectiveness of capital punishment. But fundamental moral disagreement is going to involve disagreeing about the fundamental moral principles themselves. So disagreeing about what the morality of punishment is. Is it determined by just good consequences, good outcomes, like fewer future crimes, etc., being committed, or is it about inflicting harm and suffering of an equivalent sort on those who have made victims out of others, and giving proportional and equivalent amount of suffering to the offenders than as they inflicted on their victims. Sorry, I don't know if I said that last part correctly. What I meant to say was inflicting a proportional or an equivalent amount of suffering on the offenders as they inflicted on their victims. I do think I said it right, but it was a long sentence, so I couldn't remember I couldn't remember the halfway point partway through. Okay, so hopefully we're understanding the difference between these kinds of moral disagreements. Now, there's debate about whether there's widespread or moral disagreement of the fundamental sort that the MD thesis claims. So then, right, in order for the MD thesis to be true, we have to have the fundamental moral disagreements. They have to be widespread. Okay. Okay, so so it might be the case again that there might not be a lot of fundamental moral disagreements of a widespread nature across cultures, right? It might turn out to be the case that that the disagreements are non-fundamental. Okay, or it might be that they're not widespread. I'm looking for something in the reading here. I can't find it, so I'll just continue on. Okay, so right. So is the moral diversity thesis true? Recall that the moral diversity thesis is composed of two claims. The first claim says that there are cases of intercultural moral disagreement that are fundamental, that the basic moral norms of some cultures conflict with those of other cultures. And the second claim says that such disagreements are widespread. So having illustrated and explained the difference between non-fundamental and fundamental moral disagreement between individuals, let us focus on the first claim of the MD thesis. The main thing to notice is that the fact that two cultures disagree about some moral issue does not automatically mean that the disagreement stems from a disagreement over basic moral norms. Consider the practice of putting one's parents to death once they reach a certain age. Suppose that most, if not all, of the members of some culture believe that this practice is morally obligatory. Our own culture does not hold such a moral belief and in fact holds that it is morally wrong to engage in such killing. Because this intercultural disagreement is rather striking, one might be tempted to conclude that our culture accepts as a basic moral norm something like the following: one ought to treat one's elders with respect no matter their age. Right? Furthermore, it may seem that the other culture in question rejects this moral norm, and that this is what explains the intercultural difference in moral belief about killing one's parents. It may seem that we have here an example of fundamental moral disagreement, indicating a conflict of basic moral norms. But the idea that Timmons ends up claiming or ends up making here is that this would be too hasty a conclusion to make. To see this, suppose that the culture in question believes in an afterlife full of activities like hunting and playing, and that one has one's body in the afterlife that one last had in this life. This non-moral belief about the afterlife, together with the above norm of respect, would lead one to conclude that we're not to kill one's parents because they get to be, once they get to be of a certain age, before their bodies become too decrepit to enjoy the afterlife. The point here just being is that it could be the case that even with respect to this sort of like, radically different way of treating the elderly, there's agreement about the fundamental moral claim. There's just disagreement about the non-fundamental, the non-moral, right, claims in question. So those who think that it's okay to, those cultures who think that it's okay to kill one's parents once they get to a certain age, they think that they're actually respecting their parents because they're sending them to a better place. Okay, so there's the non-moral there is there being this better place that their parents get to go to once they reach it, once they're killed, right? Once they're lived enough of this life here, they can be killed and then they get to go on and enjoy life elsewhere in their bodies. Okay, the second claim, though, remember, was that there's the fundamental disagreement is widespread. So we can put a question on whether or not there's widespread or whether there's fundamental disagreement across cultures. Then we could ask whether or not the disagreements are widespread, even if there are fundamental disagreements. So perhaps intercultural and moral disagreements can almost always be explained in terms of intercultural differences in the relevant non-moral beliefs, as in the case of the treatment of one's parents. If so, the second claim of the MD thesis is false. That is, if all or most of our intercultural disagreement is non-fundamental, and so can be traced to differences in non-moral factual beliefs. Okay. So there's questions about the fundamentality of our disagreements, and then there's the possibility that we're wrong about the disagreements that we have being widespread, and it's enough to challenge the widespread claim, or the claim about our fundamental disagreements being widespread, just by challenging the aspect of the disagreement just being non-fundamental level, or you could just challenge the fact that the disagreement is widespread, or is claimed to be widespread, right? So granted, the first part of the thesis may be true, but if there are any few fundamental moral conflicts across cultures, so the first part of the thesis is just that there's fundamental moral disagreement. So, but granted, the first part of the thesis may be true. If there are very few fundamental moral conflicts across cultures, then arguably they can be explained as being about moral issues that are extremely difficult to resolve, even though there's a single moral truth about these few disputed cases. It is a belief that there is widespread intercultural conflict in basic norms that leads some anthropologists and philosophers to embrace moral relativism. Is there such widespread conflict in basic moral norms across cultures? Okay, the issue is an empirical one to be decided by the available evidence, anthropological evidence. Although some anthropologists, particularly those who embrace moral relativism, have stressed intercultural differences and conflicts in moral norms, other anthropologists have wanted to stress intercultural similarities. So, for example, anthropologist Clyde Kluckholm notes that, quote, every culture has a concept of murder, distinguishing this from execution, killing in war, and other justifiable, quote unquote, justifiable homicides, the notions of incest and other regulations upon sexual behavior, prohibitions upon untruth under defined circumstances of restitution, reciprocity, and mutual obligations between parents and children. These and many other moral concepts are altogether universal. End quote. Writing in 1959, philosopher Richard Brandt, having examined the anthropological evidence for the thesis of moral diversity, as well as for the thesis expressed by Kluckholm, that there is widespread intercultural agreement over basic moral norms, concluded that, quote, no anthropologist has offered what we should regard as really an adequate account of a single case, clearly showing that there's ultimate disagreement in moral principle. Of course, we must remember that this lack of information is just as serious for any claim that there is worldwide agreement on some moral principle. Okay, and then Timmons goes on to note that there are issues with methodological issues with even attempting to establish that the moral diversity thesis is true. Okay, and then in response to that, Timmons considers some counter evidence that shows that perhaps something like the moral diversity thesis is true. The upshot here is just that there's enough evidence, so there's enough reason at this point to think that the moral diversity thesis is questionable. So keep in mind, there's already, it seems, decent reason to think that premise 2 is faulty. Okay, so even if we're not able to establish that 1 is faulty, we have good ground so far for thinking that 2 is faulty, unless again it could be shown that there's a difference in principle, or a principle difference, I should say, between thinking about the moral case, right, of widespread fundamental conflict of belief, right, ruling out some universally objective claim being true in its domain, the moral domain, and thinking about the scientific domain and there being widespread fundamental scientific disagreement, right, ruling out something like there being some objective universal claim that's true scientifically, right? And then you could also think about the mathematical case if you like there as well. So anyways, this argument is dubious at best. No worries though, the anthropologist runs another argument, or the anthropologist inspired argument, or arguer develops the anthropologist argument too. So AA2 we can call it. Let's go to the presentation of the Timmons. So we have the anthropologist argument version 2. 1, different cultures have different moral codes. In particular, the moral codes of some cultures include basic moral norms that conflict with basic moral norms of other cultures, and such fundamental conflicts are widespread. This just is the moral diversity thesis. So that premise remains the same across the different anthropologist arguments. 2, such conflicts cannot be resolved by rational means. So you say in the moral case, there's no rational means for resolving the cross-cultural debates about the basic moral norms. Okay. And that serves as a basis for distinguishing the scientific case from the moral case, because in the science case, we have the scientific method that we could invoke. Okay. In the mathematical case, we have we can do mathematical proofs of a method there. Okay, that allows for rational adjudication when conflict emerges, even if that conflict is widespread and at the fundamental levels. Thus, from 1 and 2, we're able to conclude there are widespread and rationally irresolvable intercultural conflicts over basic moral norms. Okay. So we get 3 from 1 and 2. We just have the MD thesis concisely put, and we can join it with this bit about rational irresolvability in the moral case. There's no way to rationally resolve the widespread fundamental moral disagreement across these different cultures with different basic moral codes. So that's where we get 3 from, just from 1 and 2, but a kind of simplified, condensed way of putting 1 and 2. For the best explanation for such irresolvable conflicts is this. So we have an argument by explanation claim here in 4. There are no universally valid moral norms applying to all cultures. So that's just a denial of the universality thesis. So the best explanation for 3 is a denial of the universality thesis. Okay. So it's not as if we're arguing that from 3, it logically follows that we can reject the universality thesis. No, the claim's weaker. It's the best explanation for the universality thesis is 3. Okay, that because if it turns out that intercultural conflicts over basic moral norms, which are widespread, turns out that they are rationally irresolvable, right? Then one, at least initially plausible explanation for that is just that there are no universally true moral principles that could allow us to adjudicate between these different cultures that have different beliefs when it comes to the basic moral norms, different moral codes with different basic moral principles on them or in them. We have these moral codes, right? And the moral codes give us these moral principles. And the thought is that across these different cultures, you're going to find lots of disagreement regarding the basic norms that are in these moral codes. What best explains the fact that there's no rational way of resolving the disagreements that are had between these different moral codes is the fact that there's just no universal standard. There's no universal principle that can guide us, right, in determining right? For resolving who's right and who's wrong. Okay. To put the point in just a slightly different way. And then 5, if there are no universally valid moral norms applying to all cultures, right? If the universality thesis is false, in other words, then what is right and what is wrong for the members of the culture depends on the basic norms of their culture. That's just moral relativism. So the denial of UT, once again, implies that moral relativism is true. Thus, what is right or wrong depends on basic moral norms of the culture in which the action is performed. And that just drops out of thinking about 4 and 5. Okay. So the way I like to put the argument is, suppose MD is true, and then 2, MD conflicts are rationally irresolvable. 3, so there are widespread and rationally irresolvable intercultural conflicts over basic norms. The best explanation for 3 is that UT is false, but if UT is false, then moral relativism is true, so therefore 3 is true. Or therefore MR is true. So this was this argument attempted to hang on to the moral diversity thesis in response to Timmons's discussion, right? The thought is we're not sure that MD is true. More empirical work would be needed. More clarification on the methodology that's needed to determine whether MD is true, right, is needed as well. So the focus becomes 2. There's an initial challenge to 2. The counter challenge, in order to rerun the anthropologist argument, is to claim that there's a moral difference, a key difference between thinking about cases of moral disagreement and cases of scientific disagreement, like those involving the shape of the earth. The key difference is that there's rational irresolvability in the moral case as opposed to in the scientific case. The best explanation for rational irresolvability in the moral case is that the universality thesis is false, that there's no single universally true principle, right, that can allow us to adjudicate or resolve some of the moral conflicts that are out there regarding the basic moral norms, the moral codes out there. But if UT is false, then moral relativism is true. So moral relativism is true. That's the anthropologist's argument too. Okay. So premise 2, a significant number of moral theories would need to be shown to be false for premise 2 to work. So we got premise 2 again. Let's go up a slide. So MD, or moral diversity conflicts, are rationally irresolvable. Right. The truth of 2 is going to depend on whether or not there is a true ethical theory that provides us with an objective or universally objective moral principle. Right? If there is such a theory out there, then 2 is false, right? If there isn't, then that's going to lend support to 2, isn't it? So support for 2 is going to require showing that every normative theory, every normative moral theory out there that attempts to provide a universally true moral principle is false. Every single such theory would have to be false. That's a lot of work to have to cover, right? It's quite an assumption, right, that would be needed to establish 2. That every single moral theory that purports to provide us with an objective or universally objective true moral principle is false. So the response to the anthropologist argument too, straight away seems to be something like 2 is false. Okay. Like, think about it. There's like, the natural thought might be there's some universally true objective moral principle out there. That seems more likely than it being the case that every single one that we could think of is false. No matter what here, this response is nice because it pushes a burden of proof back onto the person who runs this argument to say, here's why I think that these moral diversity conflicts are rationally resolvable. And then once we see those arguments, and right, more discussion could be had, more progress hopefully could be made in determining whether or not right 2 is true, and whether or not the anthropologist argument 2 succeeds, for that matter. And Richard Brandt gives us the example of chicken pull, and it seems like the behavior identified in the case is seriously, objectively wrong in a universal kind of way, counting against moral relativism. However, for the time being, he says, if only very briefly, we can indicate, if only very briefly, how a non-relativist, a non-moral relativist might attempt to respond to the above argument, anthropologist argument 2. To focus our thinking about this matter, let us ask how an individual's basic moral norms might be rationally criticized. Suppose we encounter someone who does not think it is morally wrong for people to engage in activities that inflict pain on lower animals and condones games like chicken pull, as described by Richard Brandt. Quote, in this game, a chicken is buried in the sand. Up to its neck, the contestants ride by on horseback, trying to grab the chicken by the neck and yank it from the sand. When someone succeeds in this, the idea is then for the other contestants to take away from him as much of the chicken as they can. The winner is the one who ends up with the most chicken. Obviously, a detestable practice, right? And the idea is supposed to be that thinking about cases like these, or thinking about cases like this, excuse me, should incline us to thinking should incline us to having the thought that there's some universally true moral principle out there. Of course, you can multiply examples, right? This is the chicken pull example, but now just imagine cases involving, torturing innocents, genocide on innocents, enslaving innocents, raping, full stop. Okay. So anyways, that looks like how we're going to challenge the second anthropologist argument is a challenge that second premise. Right. If it's true that there's some action out there that's objectively wrong, objectively morally wrong, no matter what moral code one subscribes to, then the moral relativist position falls apart. A big picture, the chicken pull example in the Timmons was used to show that there's at least one action that we want to say is universally, objectively wrong, thus challenging moral relativism. But then the class examples involve thinking about cases of slavery, torture, slavery, genocide, rape, and we can really multiply examples significantly if we wanted to. Now, by way of just a concluding evaluation of moral relativism in the last 2 minutes I have here, there's a lot that we could say, but one thing is going to be really important about a moral theory, whatever it is, whether it's moral relativism or Kantianism or consequentialism, is that the theory can't contradict. It can't be internally contradictory, right? But now, so imagine someone belongs to 2 different cultures. Imagine someone belongs to the culture that's associated with the Catholic Church, They also belong to the Democratic Party, which has a platform that accepts the permissibility, the very least illegal permissibility across significant range of cases of abortion. So her Catholic culture, right, on its moral code is going to have a basic principle that um, that ends up implying that abortion is morally wrong, perhaps universally so. It's going to drop out of that moral code. But that's the case. But she belongs to, remember, the Democratic Party as well. And Democratic Party and its adherents, that's another culture. The basic moral code or basic moral norm on the that's part of the moral code of the second culture that this individual belongs to is going to imply that abortion is not morally wrong. Okay, and these are across a wide range of cases, enough to where there would be conflict, right, between what this person we're considering is committed to in his or her moral theory. So at one and the same time, this person is going to be committed to abortion being both wrong and permissible. And this might get fleshed out in the following way. There are going to be a wide range of cases in which this person we're considering has to say at one and the same time that the abortion is both wrong and not wrong. And that's a contradiction. So moral relativism may very quickly lead to contradictions like the one just noted. And if that's true, then we have good reason to reject that view. There are other reasons why, but we need to stop there in the interest of time. We'll go ahead and conclude. So if anything I said this time was unclear, I didn't think I gave the clearest presentation in some places. So if anything was unclear, feel free, let me know and see if I can clarify. I have office hours tomorrow night, usual time. So feel free to pop in then. But in cases where I was unclear, I did try my best to get clear. I just became a little repetitive. So let me know if I can help out with anything. Thank you all for watching. Thanks for coming. I'm going to stop sharing and wish you all a great night. Take care. Bye-bye.